Hi kids, so today we're going to look at Lady Macbeth's descent into madness. Basically, she went from being really bad to really mad. Anyway, there's a cool picture of her looking really bad. So what are some of the things that you've learned about Lady Macbeth as you were reading? I'm sure you all did read it because that was part of the homework. Probably you read or picked up on the fact that she really aspired to greatness. You know, the minute she got Macbeth's letter, she was already making plans. This is a woman who has ambition. She also defied social rules and conventions. So you'll remember in a previous assignment, I asked you to have a look at what does the great chain of being refer to do some research on that. And you would have seen that it would have gone against the great chain of being for her to go against what her social position was or to try and challenge that. And you also notice that in Macbeth, natural events in nature would often reflect some of the unnatural things happening in the book. And that's also where the whole idea of asking you to look up how Elizabethans view superstition and that sort of thing. And that should have given you a better background and overview as to what I'm talking about right now. All right, so she hungered for power. She really wanted the crown. And she was willing to stalk her husband's ambitions to get him to do what she wanted to do, which was pretty heinous. She wanted him to commit regicide. So for those of you who don't know what regicide is the killing of a king. She gets her husband to decide to kill Duncan, or she persuades him. And this is where we also see how very powerfully persuasive Lady Macbeth is. Can you find examples in your book of how she manipulates Macbeth? This is a very important question that could also be asked in the exam. How does she go about manipulating her husband? What does she appeal to? Definitely his ambition, which is also another possible long question. And possibly also the idea of his manliness being questioned. Is he really a man or is he just a coward? So she plays on his feelings and she basically persuades him to do what she wants. So Lady Macbeth goes from being really bad, as we can see, to a total wreck in Act 5, where she's like completely mad. They've got a doctor and a nurse looking after her, and she's lost it. This woman who was so hungry for power, who was willing to do anything, is now completely devoid of her senses. And Macbeth has turned into this hellhound, which you know because you have just completed writing an essay on his descent from being a tragic hero or a war hero, to the hellhound that we see in Act 5, or at the end of the play. So, yeah, that's quite a contrast. On your screen, you'll probably see a picture of the doctor and the nurse staring in horror at Lady Macbeth as she walks through the hallways, sleepwalking and talking about the things that plague her mind. So what's the big deal? What's happened to Lady Macbeth? Well, probably the fact that she's consumed by a guilty conscience. That's also one of the things I asked you to define in a previous task that you had to do. You have to have an idea of what a guilty conscience is. So basically, we have the idea of the mind of a killer and what can happen to the mind of a killer when it is consumed by guilt. Remember that Macbeth is also his tracking of going from being more innocent to a full-on killer is also tracked. So Macbeth is a pretty cool thing, a cool play to read, because we learn about the mind of a killer. The mind of a killer, basically what could happen to you if you're consumed by guilt, and what could happen to you if you're overcome by the desire of power and the things that hold you in place, like your guilt feelings, don't keep you from doing something, and you just become like diabolical like Macbeth. But we're not focusing on him. We're focusing on Lady Macbeth. This is her. She looks real cool. And we're quickly going to look at a bit of a timeline just to help you track her transition. This is like a seriously broad overview. So, yeah, there are other things too to look at. So first of all, in Act 1, Scene 5, she calls out to evil spirits to strip her of all of her feminine qualities. and she's like, unsex me here. Super weird and evil. And she asks that the evil spirits will replace her feminine qualities with evil so that she's able to do what she needs to do, which is kill Duncan. Later on, we hear her say something like she would rather smash her newborn's baby head on a stair than not kill Duncan, which is pretty evil. So I think they helped her out there. The next thing that we notice is, I've skipped one. It's Act 1, Scene 7. It's just like in class where I make mistakes. Joy. So Act 1, Scene 7, she pressures Macbeth to kill, to go ahead with the plan. He's feeling uncertain, and she's like, no, let's do it. And she basically calls him a coward, basically says that he's not a man if he doesn't do this thing. And then in Act, it's Act 2, Scene 3, what happens there is she finds out that Macbeth killed the guards. And the strange thing is, she becomes faint. So one could argue here that her intention was only to kill Duncan, and that when the guards are killed, she sort of shows a little bit of remorse there. So maybe that is the turning point of her badness. Yeah, that's not a word, kids. Please don't use the word badness, but you know what I mean, right? So anyway, so that happens there. Then in Scene 3, Act 3, Scene 2, she protests the murder of Duncan. Not of Duncan, I lie. Of Banquo. So Macbeth's there, and he's like brooding and thinking, and she's like, what's going on? And he doesn't want to tell her. And then he tells her, and she's like, oh no, I doth protest the murder of Banquo. And then he says, oh, be quiet. You will be proud of the way in which I wasn't a coward and I went through with this. So it's kind of like her own words coming to bite her on the bum. You know, she kept telling her husband, oh, you're such a coward and whatever. And now he's like, don't worry, love, I'm going to do this thing and you're going to be so proud of me. Oh dear. Right. And then in Act 5, Scene 1, this is the golden act, because we really see how things have turned out for her in this act. She's at Dunsinane. And that is the castle. She's living there now. And she sleepwalks. And there's that whole scene of her washing her hands the whole time, because she is recreating what happened the night that they killed Duncan. So she keeps thinking about it, Duncan's murder. And that makes her totally crazy. A doctor has been called in concern for her health, and she's continuously trying to wash her hands. She's afraid of darkness. She cannot be in the dark. She's always worried about the candle. Is the candle on? So we really see a lot of what's going on in her guilt-ridden mind in Act 5. And I think it would be a good thing for you to reread Act 5 with this in mind and just make yourself a few notes on what's happening with Lady Macbeth over here. And then the penultimate thing that happens is in Act 5, Scene 5, she decides to kill herself. Oh dear. Death by guilt. Death by guilty conscience. Right, so Lady Macbeth wasn't as hardcore after all. So the other thing you notice about Act 5 is that it is comprised of 9 very short scenes. I think the shortest of those scenes is only 20 lines long. So why would Shakespeare have done this? Well, the function of this is that it hurtles the play along at a really fast pace towards its climax. And this then emphasizes the tension that keeps building, all the crazy things that are coming together to sort of make this juicy ending. All of us are sitting on the edge of our seats wondering what is going to happen to the Macbeths. In Act 5, Scene 1, the doctor and the maid, which I've mentioned before, are witnessing her psychological distress. Lady Macbeth is really coming apart at the seams, and it's anyone's guess that she will probably fall apart very soon. What's significant here is that the doctor describes Lady Macbeth's behavior as, quote unquote, a great perturbation of nature. This reflects the reference in Act 2, Scene 4, where they also use these words to refer to Duncan's horses eating each other. So there's another example of unnatural acts in nature mimicking the unnatural acts happening in the real world, the killing of a king, regicide. So therefore it appears that regicide disrupts the natural order of things, and this then plunges the world into chaos. We know there's a big storm, the earth shakes, there's a whole bunch of unnatural things happening in nature. Can you sum them up? The Doctor later on says, unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. Don't you think this really just sums up the Macbeths very well? They committed regicide and have been paying ever since with a crazy amount of events that's just like coming down on them. The hallucination of daggers, the hallucination of blood, spattered ghosts, emotional breakdowns in front of their friends, nature being all upside down. All of this points to what happens when you commit an unnatural act in the Elizabethan period. Let's also then go back real quick to Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 7, where Macbeth is really upset over the murder that he has just committed, and she's trying to calm him down and tells him, don't worry, and, quote, a little water clears us of this deed, is what she says. In other words, she's saying that they can wash Duncan's blood off with a bit of water, and so to wash off the guilt of the deed of killing Duncan. There's a vast contrast here in Act 5, where she imagines Duncan's blood stain on her hands, and she says, outdone spot, and all that. So the stain symbolizes the moral corruption that has tainted her soul. She's damned to hell for the sin of regicide. Another thing that's really interesting about the whole sleepwalking thing in Act 5, besides the fact that it shows her emo state, is that it goes hand in hand with one of the key and very big themes in the play, which is appearance versus reality. We'll still talk about that in a little bit more detail. But appearance versus reality basically refers to the confusion between how things appear, what we see, but how they really are. So what we see isn't always how things really are. Hence the whole phrase, fair is foul and foul is fair. Another quote that sort of goes together with the whole idea of appearance versus reality is that one act the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. So Lady Macbeth looked like this innocent flower, but actually she was the evil, the driving force behind what happened to Duncan. The sleepwalking echoes this idea of appearance versus reality, in that in sleepwalking, we are never quite unsure, is the person awake? Are they awake? Are they asleep? What are they doing? Right. Anyway, beside that, that's sort of like a side note there. Appearance versus reality is a very important theme. If you have picked up on some things that might go together with that, start tracking those, because that is quite a long question to ask. All right. The candle in hand is also quite interesting. Lady Macbeth enters trying to pierce the darkness with this little candle that she's carrying about. This acts as a metaphor. She is doomed. She's cocooned in this moral darkness due to her involvement in the regicide of King Duncan. With this candle, she then attempts to defer her inevitable descent into hell, which she obviously cannot do. She's marked for hell. She's done this thing, and that's that. Another key thing that we notice is that her command of language has completely changed. In Act 1, she has this masterful command of language. She's persuasive. She's able to persuade anybody to do anything. This is what characterizes her. In Act 1 and in Act 5, her language is completely broken down. This then reflects her mental breakdown as well. Here are some of the things that you can pick up in Act 5 with regards to how her language reflects the breakdown of her psychological state as well. She uses these weird short little sentences. Out, damn spot. Out, I say. 1, 2. Very short little sentence there. She also makes use of repetition. Come, 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 to bed, to bed, to bed. So she repeats a bunch of things. It's like she can't really think clearly. Then later in the play, she also says, the Thane of Fife had a wife. It's like a half-rhyming, playful little sentence. It doesn't carry the weight of the iambic pentameter in which she was speaking earlier. It also has a very obscure reference, but actually she's referring to Lady Macduff. She's the Thane of Fife's wife, who was murdered earlier in the play. And then right at the end, she sort of regresses down to sounds and doesn't even use words. She says, oh, oh, oh. So her dialogue beautifully mimics her psychological breakdown. In Act 1, she speaks in iambic pentameter, but by Act 5, she's basically speaking in prose. And this symbolizes the change in her lack of faculties, her inability to use her brain the way she did before. She is reduced to half the woman, or a shadow of the woman that she was before. So Act 5, Scene 1 is the very last time we see her, and we see her a broken woman, not at all the full glory of which she was before. And then in Act 5, Scene 5, we learn that she's dead. It is only in the final scene of the play when we actually learn that she committed suicide. She killed herself. So we can surmise that the guilt that she felt was overwhelming and caused her to take her own life. So I guess the message here is clear. If you kill a king, or, for what it's worth, commit murder, it kind of kills something inside of you. It kills your chance of entering heaven, because you're definitely marked for hell. And it also kills your inner peace. And Lady Macbeth has none of that left. So it's sort of like a reflection or a view into the mind of a murderer, from the point of view where they have a conscience, and a guilty conscience, an overwhelming guilty conscience, causes them to be overcome with guilt. Macbeth, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. So there are two murderers involved in the story, and if we look into the mind of Macbeth and what happens to him, it's the complete opposite. He takes the complete other direction. So it's quite an interesting play to read. It gives us insight into the mind of two types of murderers. So I hope you have enjoyed this. Here is a very short, concise summary of some of the main points, which you can screenshot, which will be easier.